don't freak out. I'm not actually going to show you any spiders, but I am going to talk about them in as non-vivid detail as I can. If that is a no-go for you, then, feel free to skip the introduction. You can go ahead. All of the timestamps are down in the description. For those of you still with me, let's continue. Did you know that arachnophobic people have a tendency to overestimate both the size and proximity of spiders if they see one? Kind of makes sense if you think about it. Now, just for fun, imagine you asked an arachnophobic person and a non-arachnophobic person to draw a picture of a spider that they had seen before. How do you think those two drawings might contrast? If you guess that the arachnophobic person in this example would draw a bigger, scarier spider, you would be correct. But did you know that if you give arachnophobic people guidelines about their drawings by telling them to lean into a more cute, cartoony style of a smiling spider, that can actually help reduce the intensity of the fear that they have associated with them? Now, for me personally, I got over my fear of spiders by giving every single spider I encountered a cute little old person name. Beatrice, in particular, won a place in my heart. Hi squad, welcome/welcome back, and dog, bless you. I'm not gonna lie, I had some avoidance with this one. Like, we're talking cleaned my apartment multiple times levels of avoidance, which is why I decided that I would get all nice and cozy in my bathrobe and make myself some tea before really cracking into this one. I may not have the resources for the fancy costumes and set design, but I do have various geeky shit, because I am something of a geeky shit. But the reason for my need for extra coziness is because this conversation is not a very easy one when you begin to get into the nuance of things. In addition to running the risk of minimizing real problems and validating that annoying, centrist, everyone's opinion is equally as valid type reasoning, which we will get to, this was also just really challenging to research. I don't know if it was me or the content that I was engaging with. Maybe I have a tendency to go to those kind of dark places, but I found myself doing that a fair amount. And yeah, let's talk about that. Before we really crack into things here, let's take a second to just put on our good faith bonnets, because we really have to go inward for this one. Consider it practice for those of you who are already familiar with the phenomena we're going to discuss, and a crash course for those of you who may not be. An amateur crash course. I'm hardly a professional, but still. It's my hope that by the end of this video, you'll have a newfound sense of control in a world where a lot of us don't really get a whole lot of that. So keep all of that in mind, and we will proceed. Contrary to what the name implies, mean world syndrome is not actually a diagnosis. It describes a cognitive bias, which we can think of as sort of a filter on the brain that impacts your attitudes and perceptions. The mean world perception being that the world is more cruel, violent, and dangerous than it actually is. The term goes back to the work of Professor George Gerbner in the 1970s, specifically the impacts of media on the human psyche. To summarize his findings, Gerbner found a very strong correlation between time spent watching violent television and an individual's perceptions of violence in the real world. People who spent less time watching violent television had more accurate estimates of real-world violence than people who spent more time watching television, who believe that rates of real-world violence were much higher than they actually were. Side note here, it's really important to keep in mind as we go forward that we also develop a lot of our understanding of the world based on our interactions with others. I've talked about it before on this channel, but humans are social animals. We learn from other humans. Feelings and opinions we observe in others, things we pick up through the grapevine, that sort of thing. Conversations about a topic might lead us to regard the phenomenon, people, or behavior being discussed as a lot more commonplace and powerful than is actually the case. We're remembering the frequency of the conversations more so than the frequency of the actual occurrence of the thing. Does that make sense? The more we're exposed to a concept, the more we engage with a concept, the more salient it becomes in our minds, the easier it is to see, and around we go. Now, I talked a fair amount about this in my Dave Chappelle video, but this is particularly true for stimuli that are especially jarring, fear-inducing, or worrying. The more visceral our reaction to something, the more likely it is to stick in our minds. The past 2 years' work is a great example of this. Anti-maskers, anti-vaxxers, people refusing to follow public health orders. The COVID-19 pandemic has been devastating in a number of different ways, and I don't want to minimize that. Being fearful of minimizing big problems is part of why I struggled so much approaching this topic, because it's really important to distinguish between checking our cognitive biases and downplaying these very real problems that we're facing. Because horrible things happen, and they shouldn't happen. But there's a reason why they stand out as horrible in the first place. Generally speaking, we are trending toward higher quality of life, less violent crime, and an overall improvement in the human condition. But it's hard to find this information amidst a sea of bad news, especially with our natural inclination to focus more on threats and unpleasant stimuli. It's a survival mechanism. If you have a broken wrist, it's in your best interest to be more aware of your broken wrist than every other part of your body that isn't hurting. That way, it inhibits you from attempting anything that might exacerbate your condition. Likewise, it's obviously more important that you be aware of a threat in your environment than the many other things that aren't threatening, because those aren't going to do anything bad to you, but that definitely could. Psychologically speaking, it can be in your best interest to stay informed about the humans around you and all of the people that you share your space with, especially if they are engaged in potentially dangerous or antisocial behaviors. Why do you think drama streams and channels have the engagement levels that they do? And why do you think news outlets focus so much on bad news and negativity? Because we watch. In the case of COVID-19, the pandemic itself is a very real, very big threat. Big to the point that it's hard for a lot of us to really comprehend. And the fact that it's so incomprehensibly large means that our only real response to it is to feel incredibly threatened and incredibly helpless. So there's something almost cathartic about focusing on the far more comprehensible problem of all of the people who have responded to this very big threat with outright denial. It's easy to concoct a sense of control by condemning the bad behavior of others. This can help alleviate the sense of helplessness that we feel about the bigger, badder issue. But in doing this, these issues begin to take up more of our focus, and therefore our reactions to them become reflective more of how much space they take up in our minds and less about how much space they actually take up in the world itself. It becomes easy to underestimate other things or forget about them entirely, such as what I mentioned earlier about us generally trending in a more positive direction, and we have the stats to support that. Part of the reason for this trend too is the very fact that we're able to talk about these problems more and on a much larger scale, which puts us in sort of a catch-22. The more we talk about the bad news, the more aware we become of the bad news, the more likely we are to take the steps to begin fixing those problems. But by having it take up so much space in our collective consciousness, it can make it seem like the problem is actually increasing when generally the opposite tends to be true. So it's very important that we don't turn a blind eye to these problems or the devastating losses that come with many of them. But for the sake of our continued momentum, we need to be aware of the progress we're making at the same time. Seeing the good isn't only important in having a balanced perspective, it's also essential in how we shape our own behavior. When you come to believe that the world skews toward cruelty, you run the risk of anticipating conflict over resolution. Strike before being struck becomes an increasingly tempting approach to interaction, and a lot of people give in to that temptation, which we will talk about another time. But things get even more complicated than this because of course they do. Our threat-focused bias is a byproduct of our animal survival instincts, but we no longer live in a world where the threats that we face are easily neutralized. Technology evolves and changes a lot faster than we do. Humans process threats like any other animal by having time to remove themselves from it, shake it off, and just kind of process those heavy feelings that they went through. So what does that human tendency to prioritize threats mean in the age of social media and that constant barrage of information? So, mean world syndrome is just the tip of the iceberg, at least in this conversation. It all goes back to Gerbner's original idea of cultivation theory, which is just a more general look at how media impacts our perceptions. It's pretty self-explanatory. As you engage with content, you absorb the content, you apply it to your view of the world. It's a pretty well-supported cultural theory, but it's not without its limitations, because by virtue of focusing entirely on media, you lose other important contributing factors that color people's perceptions. A particularly important example of a contributing factor would be people's lived experiences, which we're going to get into a little bit more here. We already know that Gerbner found a clear correlation between media consumption and skewed perceptions of the world. In his study, the low media consumption group was defined as 2 hours or less, and the high media consumption group was defined as 4 hours or more. Now, I bring up the specific numbers here because I want to encourage you to ask yourself what this could imply in a day and age where the average screen time for people born after 1990 is 7 hours a day. Don't panic. I know I may be basically a boomer, but I promise this isn't going to devolve into me griping about the problems with technology simply because I don't understand it, as is evidenced by the quality of my videos. There are some really incredible things about the internet. Relationships are formed online. People lacking community have the opportunity to find it. We have access to instant information at our fingertips all the time. We literally walk around with supercomputers in our pocket capable of accessing every single piece of information our species has compiled in an instant. I use mine to look at pictures of dogs and obsessively check the weather. But the flip side of this easy and instant access to everything is that we have easy and instant access to everything. And our monkey brains are going to hone in on the things that they deem the most important. The things that threaten us. Social media is speedrunning cultivation theory. And the interactive nature of it means that our lived experiences go from being a filter on personal interpretation to an influence on how other people think. And this can be good or bad, but it does come with a certain responsibility. Not only do we have to ask ourselves what kind of relationships we're forming, which communities we're seeking out, what information we're consuming, we also have to take time to ask ourselves how we are contributing to it. Our judgments of the world, our tailored perceptions inform what kind of material we engage with. Social media is a powerful tool for enhancing attitudes because it not only strengthens them based on the feed that we cultivate, but we continue to fuel the machine every time we contribute to it. Sometimes this is for the better, and sometimes not so much. The stress hormone, cortisol, is just as addictive as any other chemical substance that alters our state of being, and it's very easy to keep going back to the source of where we last got it. Now, I'm sure that for most of you, none of this is really news. Most of us are pretty familiar with the addictive echo chamber effect of social media, but it's really important to take a moment to stress the snowball effect that can happen here. Even if you take time to correct your confirmation bias by seeking out a variety of information, you're more likely to retain things that already fit with your preconceived worldview. Given that your perceptions not only guide how you seek information, they also guide how you interact with it and what you commit to memory, this means that your perceptions of the world are oftentimes more a portrait of yourself rather than an accurate reflection of reality. Big asterisk here, because we're going to come back to that. Because before anyone jumps on that statement, I am not saying that by consuming media with specific themes and leanings, you are detached from reality. Rather, you're just getting a specialized view of reality. And if you specialize too much, you run the risk of missing other relevant information that may actually boost your understanding of the world, especially when it comes to nuanced issues. As an example, it's particularly important to seek out the perspectives of people who actually have the lived experience that media can't really fill in the blanks on. Specializing too much in just one perspective can lead to kind of extreme points of view, and these extremes are where we usually start to lose control. This sort of mental and emotional manipulation, be it accidental or intentional, is what we see taking place when people get sucked into cults or conspiracy theories, or when less explicitly dangerous but equally as slimy grifters try to steer audience attitudes in a way that feeds their agenda. But let's get back to that big old asterisk here. Because at this point, you're probably sitting there like, okay, so you're saying I need to listen to both sides for a balanced view, and here we go with every opinion matters all over again, and that's not what I'm saying. Obviously, a more informed opinion is generally going to be a better opinion. That's kind of the point. That's more what we're getting at. I think a lot of self-proclaimed centrists have eroded the ground here and made it really difficult for people to get footing, because they've painted the idea of balanced reasoning as willingness to listen equally to informed opinions and batshit hate mobs like both of these opinions are equally as valid. Not the case. I shouldn't have to say that, but apparently people really struggle with understanding this. Further problems arise in this particular dynamic because the members of the batshit hate mob group tend to be very ready to engage with anyone who is willing to listen. The people being targeted by hate, on the other hand, are more likely to be exhausted by having to endure all of that harassment and therefore less likely to put the time and effort into educating, which is a very demanding thing to have to do, especially when you're defending your very existence. All of this to say, there's already an imbalance in information, and it runs the risk of being intensified via the mechanisms that we've discussed. Knowing how to identify good information is absolutely crucial here, and it's important to keep in mind that being critical of your own perspectives and the limitation of your own scope doesn't mean that you need to be less critical elsewhere. What I'm trying to communicate here is that the first person you should be questioning when you're confronted with new information is yourself. Something that might be able to help with finding the balance here is regarding your worldview as something that is inherently flexible, and regarding yourself as someone who enjoys being challenged, someone who's strong enough to sit with the discomfort of your beliefs being confronted with information that conflicts with them. So ask yourself right now, are you strong enough to do that? And when did you do it last? If you were, right now, to be confronted with information that challenges your pre-existing understanding of a topic, what would your reaction be? Better question, what would you want your reaction to be? We already talked about the interactive nature of social media and the implications that that carries. Before social media, we had to be aware of the content we were consuming. But now that we're able to put information out into the ether with equal ease, it puts a new spin on things. We need to ask ourselves how we want to use that power, because you're not just cultivating ideas at this point. You're cultivating a specific version of yourself, and you shine a light on who that is every single time you engage on social media. Now, some people just don't care if they cause harm. Some people even like causing harm, and I don't have time for y'all today. I'm here to talk to the people who want to learn and teach in turn. Like I said, we will discuss that at another time. Most of us think of ourselves as good and rational. And one of the most rational things we can do is examine whether or not our self-concept is supported by the behaviors that we engage in. So if you look over your contributions to this global forum that is the internet, what kind of person do you appear to be? And how close to or far off is it from the person that you want to be? And finally, if you do find that you're contributing to harm, especially if you're reacting from a defensive place, is your reaction proportional to the threat itself, or is it reflective of the space that that threat takes up in your mind? And we're back. Like I said at the beginning of this video, what I'm hoping people are going to leave with is a newfound sense of power. Not necessarily over all of the problems in the world that we live in, but rather the impact that we can have by how we engage with them. And I'm treading very carefully here because toxic positivity is its own can of worms. Put the secret down. Better yet, throw it out entirely. You can't drastically change the world around you and manifest your every desire through the power of positive thinking. What you can change is yourself. And what you can control are the actions that you take. And a lot of it comes down to what you want to prioritize. Being prepared to combat a cruel and unforgiving world, or being the kind of person who will make that world a little less cruel and unforgiving in the first place. And this isn't to say that kindness is an easy thing to choose in many instances. Theoretically, every person has the option of choosing kindness and nonviolence in any given situation. But by the very nature of how cruelty works, it more often than not falls on the people being targeted by it to take the steps in dismantling it. This isn't fair. There's no but here. It just isn't fair. Other people and forces outside of yourself subjecting you to cruelty for literally no reason and then refusing to budge until you begin the process of mutual healing is an incredibly unjust and frustrating dynamic. And this is true across the board, from having to be the first to apologize in an interpersonal conflict to having to shoulder the burden of your own subjugation. And I don't want to minimize the fact that oftentimes when people are told to be the bigger person, they're essentially being told to just accept abuse. It makes sense that we would want to talk about that as much as we do. I don't actually have a solution for this one. I think it's just one of those difficult conversations that we might need to keep having because there's so much nuance that needs to be unpacked. Growth never really stops. and it's very rarely a comfortable process. But a means of finding some peace, comfort, and a sense of control within this process is by looking at the patterns of how you engage with people and the content that you consume. Ask yourself if maybe there's some information that you're missing, information that could help balance out your view of the world and maybe help alleviate a little bit of that fear and hopelessness. For many of us, there's a fair amount of hope to be found in the knowledge that things might not actually be as bad as we think they are. Looking into good news a little bit more often also gives us the opportunity to just kind of have space and turn off for a while. Because marginalization and erasure means being burdened with a pretty heavy mental load, even when we're in solitude or amongst members of our own communities. It's an act of rebellion against those systems that cause us pain if we can take that time to step aside from our pain for a while. And I wanted to talk about this because I know that for me personally, I am so bad at doing that. I wasn't even fully aware of how much I fixate on certain topics until very recently when my partner just asked me outright if I ever get exhausted by all of the social commentary that I'm constantly consuming and engaging with, the nature of which tended to be pretty intense. And him just asking me that question was like a total galaxy brain moment. It is vital that we continue to work on those problems that persist, but we're going to get nowhere in doing this if we don't also take time to step back, recharge, and disengage from threats. It's important for us to make sure that within these efforts, we also foster hope and kindness. Those of us who have the option of doing that are more useful to those who can't if we take time to make sure that our motivation and compassion stays intact. That is all I have to say on this for now. I would like to follow up soon-ish on this topic by examining some generational differences in perceptions of the world. That was originally going to be part of this video, but it ended up being kind of a lot, and I don't have the editing skills to make these more interesting than just me talking at a camera, and so an hour of that would be kind of rough. Remember in your compassion cultivation that you are a whole human being. Feel all your feelings, maintain your sass, but in doing so, be attentive and ask yourself what kind of behaviors those are fostering. Now go do something fun just for the hell of it, and I will see you next time. And as always, thanks for watching.